Roy, I appreciate you carving out a little bit of your weekend afternoon to talk with me about media coverage of 9/11, September 11, 2001. It is to this day, kind of stands out as being an event that the media covered in a way unlike any other event in our lifetime. I mean, we could throw back to perhaps Pearl Harbor, but neither one of us remembers what that was.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's true.
yeah. So I have something of an expertise developed over the last year or so on what the Wall Street Journal did on 9/11. You have an expertise to some degree as to what the New York Times did on 9/11, at least a portion of its coverage. And I've been doing a little bit of research to help us both take a look at what some other news organizations have done. I do know that for the research I did for September 12th, that CNBC, at least online on YouTube and elsewhere, has its morning coverage starting with its anchor, Mark Haynes, who was on the air. And he said, I'm going to interrupt you now. I'm just hearing about something taking place at the World Trade Center. And I'm paraphrasing Mark Haynes, the late Mark Haynes, who basically said, is that the World Trade Center? Because CNBC was showing live video of the flaming North Tower when it hit at 8:56. And so its coverage is up there. I think you and I are going to focus mostly on print, but there are some interesting details as it pertains to broadcasting. I'm going to talk about, during our conversation, I'm going to show some of the resources that I relied on for my reporting. Maybe this book originally had a book jacket. I don't know. This book is Running Toward Danger. And I'll put it up. Have you ever seen this book?
I have, yeah, and it's Alicia Shepard, right?
Yeah, well, she was one of the contributors to it. Kathy Trost and Alicia Shepard. It was published by the Newseum. I think it was published in 2002, but it has, what I liked about this book as a resource for my book, September 12th, is it has a whole lot of recollections of journalists who covered 9/11, not just for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but for CNN, for CNBC, for the Associated Press, for Spanish language papers, and they're given in little vignettes or anecdotes, many of which repeat. So this page I happen to point to had Marcus Broccoli on it, and Marcus Broccoli is in my book quite a bit, and he repeats throughout this. His wife was working for Maggie Farley was working for the LA Times at the time and helped to cover 9/11. So as we talk today, I'm going to show you a few things like this. Again, this is Running Toward Danger. I don't think it's in current print. I bought it on eBay. I wasn't able to find it at normal bookstores or whatnot. And again, it's now 18 years since that book was published, but it gives whereas I do a deep dive on the Wall Street Journal, and I'll explain in a minute why the Wall Street Journal merits a deep dive. This does sort of a broad, across the board look, and it's got lots of photos in it. I have very limited photos in my book, in part because given the press of time that I had to put it out, I had some issues with trying to get rights to photos. I mean, they're out there. Plus, as I said, Roy, they're out there. In other words, you don't have to pick up a copy of September 12th to see photos, although there are some nice photos in the book that pertain specifically to the Wall Street Journal. There's a young, handsome fellow named Roy Harris, whose photo appears in the book. Yeah, some similarity to you. He looks somewhat like you, and he's there with his two sons, and your two sons, RJ and Dave, kind of drove home a point to me, Roy, about how much time 20 years really is,
Yeah,
because they were both teen boys at the time, and now they're both in their 30s, correct?
right. And they're not
Which
going to
is,
like, especially RJ isn't going to like the way he looked at 13.
well, tell him to send me a photo of what he looks like now, and I'll post it online, and so people can know that I'm trying to flip through this real quickly here, so I can show you this photo. There we go. Where to go? Morning after, yeah, but that's not it. So we have one more.
It was kind of deep in the chapter, I think.
No, I know. I'm just looking for it. It should be here. Messenger. Well, you know what? This version, this version of the book doesn't have it because it wasn't. I'll get it from here. That's all right. I got it. No, I'm sitting there looking for the photo, but the version that I was looking at was a pre-print proof, and it wasn't in there. So, give me one more second.
Just so it's in the version I sent them as
So
a
we can,
gift.
yeah. So we can. Oh, it is. So
Ah,
we can embarrass them uh, appropriately. And I thought this is so odd. Anyway, you were there. This is you with your two boys, and you were
mhm,
there in 2000. Is that right?
right, right. Just for a tour of New York City and took the boat around the island and then actually went up to the top of the Twin Towers. And
Yeah.
as you know from that little section in the book, that was one of the things that so shocked me. We'll talk about that later. I was supposed to be, by total coincidence, coming down to New York from Boston on September 11th. I rented a car and everything, and in the end, I had to wait. I just couldn't leave them that night. I just had too much of an intimate relationship with them and New York to think that I could leave these kids and let them go to school on their own the next day without,
Yeah.
as I
So you
mentioned,
haven't seen the whole book yet. It's on its
no,
way.
it's in the mail. I got a note
Right.
today from Amazon.
Right. Oh, good. So that's a just because I didn't want to be outdone by you. These were my two children in 2000 on top of the World Trade Center. And if you have the book, if you actually have the physical book, in the background, you can see the Empire State Building.
Um,
They all also are now 20 years older. So let's just set a little bit of background. Um, this is your terrific book, Pulitzer's Gold. You came out with the first edition in 2007, if I'm correct.
a little earlier, 2006.
Okay, and this is the 2016 edition,
Right, right.
updated. And what you are talking about is throughout the book is the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism. But clearly through that, and you have been closely associated with Poynter Institute, you have a expertise on journalism excellence. And what we want to explore in our chat on this call really is journalism excellence. What were some of the ingredients that made the New York Times's coverage worthy of the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism? The Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news. The first time it won it in its 112-year history at that point. And as far as I know, it's not won it again since. I think it's the one and only time the Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news. And so I'd like to sort of peel back, if we could, and take a look at what they did. It was a major event, so you could probably anticipate that somebody was going to win a Pulitzer Prize or
Yep.
multiple Pulitzer Prize that's covering that event. You know the Pulitzer Board better than I do. They like that. They like that type of thing, do they not? They like to look at coverage of big events.
Yeah, my reading of the board, and of course it's changed. It's now 104, 105 years old, the Pulitzer Prizes. And started in 1917, so I have to figure from there. That the board has a number of interesting characteristics, and one is that I think, especially in the last few years, it likes to do something a little different. There are all sorts of awards that come out first, and my reading is that the Pulitzer Prize really want to set themselves kind of aside from other kinds of awards. Certainly in public service, they're looking for something. They're ornery. They like to do something that nobody else has honored. And in the case of the Wall Street Journal, the idea of winning a prize for breaking news coverage, you're right, it had never won before. But when you think about it, how could they have won a prize for public service? I mean, sorry,
For breaking news.
For breaking news, because they're not really, the investigative. Yes, they'll be in the running for investigative reporting because obviously it has those kind of reporters who will dig into a story and break it wide open. But as for a breaking news coverage, it's usually going to be, a fire or a hurricane or something like that, where you're up against the competition. And this was a really unusual case for the Journal, where it was a breaking news prize, but they were the ones that were broken in a way.
Let me ask you a question that I didn't prepare you for. And the reason I didn't prepare you because it didn't occur to me. So I'll ask you the question, and if you have an answer, great. And if not, and I'll ask myself, after you answer, I'll ask myself the same question. Again, I hadn't thought of it before we got on the call. But if tomorrow you were the managing editor of a national news organization and a disaster struck, something large, something that would be reverberate for years to come, what would you do as managing editor in terms of assigning stories, assigning reporters, etc.?
Well, the first thing I do is think team. I've never been, I think, the kind of reporter who's just out there on his own without advice around him, and that's one of the things that's the key to your book, September 12th, and what happened with the Wall Street Journal was the need to get the brain power somehow together when they were all over the city. Only a handful were actually in the office when the planes hit, because it was before 9 o'clock. So I mean, that's the first thing. I'm not the kind of person who'll sit down and say, well, here's point A, point B, point C. You do that, you do that. I'm not Paul Steiger, in other words. But Paul Steiger, as the executive editor, wasn't able to do that right away. I mean, in the early stages, he was a little bit busy surviving. And it's the assistants around him who somehow managed to pull together. And that's why the story is so magnificent for anybody who's ever worked for the Wall Street Journal, to see how that happened when it really could have all been different.
I'll tell you one lesson, journalism lesson, that I take away from covering the Wall Street Journal and what it did. And that is, if I were managing editor tomorrow and there was a major disaster, I would immediately say, forget your titles and forget your beats. I am going to look at who's available, who's got the skill set to cover this regardless. And I'll give you an interesting example of that. The Washington Post put out a special edition on 9/11. It came out on 9/11. They took it to commuter areas, things like that, and mostly gave it away free. The Carla Robbins was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Washington on 9/11, but her husband.
Were you talking about 9/12 when they came out?
The Washington Post published on 9/11, and they were not the only newspaper to publish special editions on 9/11. I may have a copy of the Washington Post 9/11 edition here. Let me just see.
Because the Washington Post obviously would have had a
look at this
published.
Yeah. Can you see the Washington Post on 9/11?
Yeah.
Published this special edition. And
Go read all about it.
I was mentioning to you that Carla Robbins was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, but her husband, Guy Gugliotti, I don't know if I mispronounced it, but her husband, Guy, wrote the lead story for the Washington Post.
Wow.
He was, at the time, their science writer. The Washington Post, you talk about, again, what are the journalism lessons? It said, who have we got available in the newsroom who's a seasoned veteran reporter and writer? And they didn't care about the fact that he didn't cover terrorism, that he didn't cover disasters. They recruited him for the same day to do that. In the Los Angeles Times edition that came out also on 9/11, not on 9/12.
They had a little bit of an 3-hour advantage.
That's correct. Look, this was the 9/11 edition of the Los Angeles Times, and the two writers here for it, Geraldine Baum and Maggie Farley. Maggie Farley is the wife of Marcus Broccoli. Marcus Broccoli was the national editor of the Wall Street Journal. And her assignment, her beat, was the United Nations and Canada, Maggie Farley's. But the LA Times didn't care. She was near ground zero. She and Marcus lived in Brooklyn Heights. She started reporting immediately. So I think one of the first lessons that I would take away from what the Journal did, from what the Washington Post did, the LA Times. Now, I don't know about the New York Times, but they didn't care any longer about what your beat was. Right. They basically said, if you're the kind of reporter who can report this story, you're assigned to the story.
Well, another factor there, and I think that's a very strong point for journalism lessons for everyone. But for those people who don't know exactly how the Wall Street Journal works, and I'm not sure anybody does actually, but basically bureaus are set up, including New York, are set up so that people do have specialties, but they also spend time working on what we always called spot news. And you had to be a double duty person. It was part of the nature of the job for the Wall Street Journal, probably more than other newspapers. I've worked at the LA Times and I've worked at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and there wasn't quite that same differentiation. If you were following, city government, that's pretty much what you did in St. Louis. And if you had to cover a riot, well, they'd probably find somebody else to do it than the City Hall reporter. But at the Wall Street Journal, I covered, my beat was aerospace and aviation in Los Angeles. And yet I had my spot news duty. I had to know every company in LA. I had to know when there was a riot. I was the one, we had a couple of them in LA. You remember Rodney King?
Yes, we do.
We had to prepare for all of that. And I was on that duty. That was my 9/11. I was caught downtown when the riots.
So let's synthesize it in terms of saying, one, be flexible in terms of, if you're an editor, be flexible in terms of who you assign. You don't necessarily assign the given reporters. You assign who's available and who can do a good job. Two, the second point that I think you bring out is for journalists themselves, not to think, well, I'm the entertainment reporter, or I am the aerospace reporter, I'm the consumer products reporter, but to realize that regardless of what your beat is, in extraordinary circumstances, you need to be well enough versed on everything that your news organization covers such that you can step up and take on any assignment. And I think that's a good point. I'll tell you a third journalism lesson. Again, Roy, I didn't prepare these. I'm just thinking about it as you and I talk. But a third lesson that strikes me is what Alan Murray did. Alan Murray on 9/11 was the Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. And in fact, on 9/11 itself, a lot of the responsibility for assigning stories and editing stories fell into his lap. The Wall Street Journal's New York bureau was destroyed, and Washington had its own copy desk. Unlike some of the other bureaus, it had some very seasoned writers and editors. So Washington Bureau picked it up. But on 9/11, he already began thinking about, conceiving what long-term story they ought to be writing while things were still unfolding. The Pentagon was burning, the Twin Towers had collapsed, but he already was thinking ahead and saying, what do we need to cover in the days and weeks to come? And I'm going to begin assigning it now. And so on the morning of September 12th, the very morning of September 12th, he already assigned a feature story to 5 different journalists: Helene Cooper, Ianthe Dugan, Brian Grewley, Phil Kuntz, and Josh Prager. 4 of them, the last one was Josh Prager, was already on book leave. But the other 4, he pulled off of their normal reporting responsibilities and set them on doing a feature that would examine in great detail 5 of the lives of people who were impacted by the collapse of the World Trade Centers. And so that was already underway. The ground zero was still smoldering, literally, and he was already, as a managing editor, effectively, as an editor, thinking ahead, saying, I'm not going to just figure out what we're going to do for the September 13th edition of the Wall Street Journal. What he set in motion on the morning of September 12, 2001, was a feature that ran on the front page called 5 Lives on October 12, 2001. I detail a lot of what happened there and the 5 journalists who wrote the 5 Lives story and how it impacted them, but he was already thinking ahead. We mentioned Marcus Broccoli. Marcus Broccoli was the national editor, so his job really was to pull together essentially all of the breaking news on 9/11. Fairly early in the afternoon, he delegated out what else had to be done to get the paper out that night, and he already began working on what the journal called the SCED, or the WIP list, work in progress, what stories they needed to have in the September 13th paper. Mm-hmm. So even in the middle of this crisis, where at the journal at least there was real doubt if they could even get out a September 12th newspaper, the top editors were already planning the September 13th newspaper, and they were already planning the October 12th newspaper. And that's another lesson, that you can't be so distracted by what's happening in the immediate moment, not to say to yourself, we publish every day. We've got to be, or we broadcast every day. We've got to be looking ahead.
So that's really terrific. And I could suggest a corollary to that, because all
Please.
sorts of thoughts pop up when you're thinking about this. Certainly, thinking ahead, you have to have somebody who's got that as a primary motive here. But on the other hand, I think one other very valuable thing that comes out of the story of the journal's coverage of 9/11 is that it's great to have somebody who has the role of a documentarian. Thinking ahead, sure, but a part of what's going on here was in the hands of one Jim Pancero. Yep. And truly amazing role. When you look back on it, what probably most people at the journal remember, aside from his essentially running the desk, is that he also kept this diary of what was going on at any given moment, who was doing what. He needed it for the moment-to-moment decisions, but that what I think was also very valuable in the next couple of days, because there was this prior day's sked was totally filled out. You knew who had done what, you knew who you could turn to. And that, I know you had a chance to read it too, but when I went through the diary that he put together of what had happened that day, it was a brilliant study of what went right and what went wrong. A lot went right. But I think that maybe is a lesson too. Have somebody who has that in the back of the mind. What did you do during the day? What went right and what went wrong?
I failed to mention, I'm talking about Pulitzer's Gold and your knowledge about the New York Times, but I actually failed to mention that for Poynter Institute, you wrote the definitive 10-year
Yeah.
reflection on the Wall Street Journal. So and that was fresher then, 10 years after than September 12th is 20 years after, in terms of, at least in terms of the people's memories of what happened. You know, part of what I say in my author's note in this book is that no one will ever forget 9/11. Only many people have. They've forgotten a lot of the details, or they have conflicting details as they try to remember it. And some people, and this is a good journalism lesson too. I mean, I found it out in many ways the hard way. Some people remember very clearly things that never happened. They just didn't happen. And then I would go back and I would verify that they never happened. So I'll give you an example without naming names, because I would never want to embarrass somebody. So the Journal had a backup newsroom in South Brunswick, New Jersey, and some of the editors were able to make it to the backup newsroom on 9/11. And in writing the book, I wrote a lot about Jim Pensero, and the person I'm talking about is not him. But in writing the book, one of the people at South Brunswick insisted to me that this person saw Karen Elliott House in Princeton, in South Brunswick on that day. Karen Elliott House was married to Peter Kahn. Peter Kahn was the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. Karen Elliott House on 9/11 was a VP of international editions or something. But presumably, if Karen Elliott House had been in South Brunswick, she would have been the most senior Dow Jones executive available. Well, this person insisted to me, credible journalist, that Karen Elliott House was there. Well, of course, I could confirm with a number of people that Karen Elliott House was in Hong Kong on 9/11 and could not possibly have been there. But that also is a journalism lesson, that when you're asking people to remember things from years ago, they sometimes remember things that never actually happened. So everything has to be verified, especially doing what I would call modern history. I mean, virtually everybody in the book who I talk about on 9/11 is still alive today. So I could interview virtually everyone and say, what are your recollections? But it did come clear to me in time that some people differed in their recollections. Two people in the same room had different recollections, and that some people remembered things that just never happened.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't encounter that at all in the 10 years later story, and maybe, time is probably the reason, is that people had, their facts straight because it was still very real. 20 years is a big.
Let me read this. This is the citation from the Pulitzer Prizes for Public Service 2002 to the New York Times. For a nation challenged, a special section published regularly after the September 11th terrorist attacks on America, which coherently and comprehensively covered the tragic events, profiled the victims, and tracked the developing story locally and globally. Do you know, Roy, and it's okay if you don't, but do you know when A Nation Challenged was born? When did they begin working on that? I mentioned that 5 Lives at the Wall Street Journal was launched. It was born on the morning of September 12th. Was A Nation Challenged born that early in the process?
No, it was within 4 or 5 days, and it took a while to be born. I do trace that in my chapter, because that was one of the fascinating things to me was, since A Nation Challenge was really the hook on which they hung the Public Service Prize, I needed to find out how that developed. The first way I got into it was through talking to Christine Kay, who was the editor there, who had come up with the idea for Portraits of Grief, which I think somewhere in the citation, it wasn't in there when you read, but it was mentioned in the discussion of the award for A Nation Challenge that Portraits of Grief was a major component of this. And to me, that was in much the same way that you found these magnificent little footnotes that grew into huge stories, like, for example, how the how the front page was able to be produced. How in the heck did that ever happen with 6 columns? And how people had said, no, Paul, we can't do that.
Right,
We
right.
can get out of paper, but we can't do so. And then you told that story brilliantly, I thought. But in the case of the New York Times, they didn't know how to talk about victims. That would have been the case for the Wall Street Journal, except the Wall Street Journal didn't have to have a list of people who had died in New York City, because
Right.
that's not part of their job. It certainly is the New York Times. Christine Kay, and again, this I'm answering the question about a nation challenge by starting with this component of it that just kind of grew. She came in with no idea. She was assigned to write about victims. And you think about a case like 9/11 where you knew thousands were dead, but where are you going to get the names? And how can you identify someone as a victim when they haven't been formally found or declared dead? So that's how the idea of portraits of grief came up. They couldn't call them obituaries, but they knew that people were suffering because they'd lost loved ones or couldn't find them. And her brilliant idea came from seeing, just an amazing story of seeing the flyers, people saying, have you seen my husband? Have you seen my son?
Yeah.
And that's what gave her the idea of coming up with something that's a portrait of grief, like those flyers were portraits of grief. And I think the whole Nation Challenge kind of grew the same way. The staff had these meetings banging their heads together about how are we going to handle this? And at some point, very early on, second or third day after 9/11, the decision was made that they needed to devote a section, special section, to what was going on around 9/11 and the investigations, and the foreign attacks to find out who did it. All of that came under the title of a Nation Challenge, so that you no longer would be a New York Times, a New York story. And so that's why you began to see a Nation Challenge come together. And I talk about how the titles were all bandied about, different things they could call it. Portraits of Grief, first of all, was, what were some of the other ones that came up? The Missing or something like that. But all kinds of portraits they came up with, and they liked the idea of using the word portrait, but they didn't know what to say about portraits of what. And everyone kind of settled on grief. The same thing happened with the Nation Challenge. The brilliant idea was to create a special section. Still had the front page. They still had their, other basic sections, Business Day and the rest. But the idea of coming up with a section that just looked at all aspects of 9/11 and what was growing out of it. And that's
How
why
often did that section run? Was that a daily section?
it was every day. And boy, that's a good question of when they stopped running it. But it was certainly a period of months that it ran as a Nation Challenged. And Portraits of Grief every day was part of that. And what they decided to do, I think this is one thing that probably really stuck with the Pulitzer Board, because it was a unique approach. Although, as I found out, there were some precedents for it with Christine Kay. But they decided to keep those portraits individually to 200 words, or roughly 200 words, and to focus not on an obit squeezed down to 200 words, but on some feature of that person that the reporter would find that marked them as unusual, that stood out for them. So, it could be somebody was a soccer, who was known for being a soccer coach at home, even though he might have been the CEO of a company. Somehow the role of the soccer coach for his son was the thing that people were grieving about. And so each of those had that kind of theme, which together seemed to come to kind of describe in a way the way the total loss happened, that it was so many little tiny stories that all came in together into one horror.
It's how many, do you know how many, for the Wall Street Journal, ultimately when it won the Pulitzer for breaking news, it submitted 10 stories, and from a variety of different authors, some of which actually appeared in the journal without a byline, just by
Yes.
staff. I mean, the from the journal, the front page left-hand column, which was really was reporting kind of the eyewitness reports for the journal. That was written by Brian Grulley, but he didn't take a byline. It was there. Do you have an idea how many different journalists were involved with A Nation Challenged?
Well, I would say almost the whole staff. The rule for the Pulitzers is you mentioned the 10 stories for the Wall Street Journal. The rule for the Pulitzers is it's limited to 20 entries.
Okay.
So the number of stories, or in this case, sections that they could enter, mainly I think it was stories and with some sections, is 20, but pretty much the whole staff would have been involved to some degree, especially with the portraits of grief. They did have, there's a great footnote to that though. An awful lot of people were on this. If they did assemble it as a volume, by the way, I have it over here somewhere, Portraits of Grief, as a book that has all of the however many thousands little portraits, was published as a book called Portraits of Grief.
It's a good resource. Go
Excuse me?
ahead.
Oh, yeah.
I said it's a good resource. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to read you. I want to read you something from my own book.
Sure.
And again, I realize in talking to you that there's a lesson in here for journalism students and other journalists about being well read. Many people believe it's obviously arguable and subjective that Brian Grulley, who's no longer at the Wall Street Journal, that he was one of their best writers, and he did, for the Five Lives feature that ran October 11, 2000 and 2001, he did take the memos from the other four journalists and turn it into the Five Lives story. But I want to read this to you, and there is a lesson for journalism students. It's only 3 paragraphs, really. Five Lives is only 2 degrees of separation from Thornton Wilder's 1927 Pulitzer Prize winning novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey. Set in the early 18th century, Wilder describes the fictional backstories of 5 travelers who perish when an ancient Inca rope bridge that they're traversing collapses, sending them plunging into the river far below. The tragedy is witnessed by a friar, Brother Juniper, who sees the hand of God in their deaths and spends the next 6 years learning and documenting everything he can about the victims in an attempt to find a justification for their violent demise. One more paragraph. John Hersey read The Bridge of San Luis Rey as he crossed the ocean to interview survivors of the atomic blast at Hiroshima, Japan, and was inspired by Wilder's narrative methods. The resulting article, Hiroshima, was published in the August 1946 edition of The New Yorker, taking up the magazine's entire issue. And Brian Grulley was familiar both with John Hersey and with Thornton Wilder, well read. Thornton Wilder was writing a fiction book in 1927, but he modeled Five Lives after those 2 authors, Thornton Wilder and John Hersey. And, I don't know where the inspiration for A Nation Challenge came, but in essence, neither Five Lives or A Nation Challenge was invented there.
No,
These
right.
were, the idea of those types of profiles or obituaries was found in fiction literature going back to 1927. And again, so what is a lesson if you're a journalism student, if you're a journalism academic, if you're teaching? And that is, let your students read fiction, assign fiction in some cases, in order to give your students a well-rounded, that's why it's a liberal arts education, a well-rounded education, so that they can extrapolate from literature, maybe from movies, from plays, whatever it happens to be, concepts that they can translate into reporting disasters, if you will.
And another corollary to that might be familiarize yourself with the Pulitzer Prizes, because of course John Hersey also won the Pulitzer Prize for Hiroshima, and
That's right.
was one of the truly great pieces of journalism being turned into a book that way, and broke a lot of molds. He made a lot of people angry with that book. Things that people had tried to keep from us. We're reading about that today. The New York Times is going back and looking at what it wrote about nuclear science and the atomic bomb, and that radiation wouldn't kill anybody.
Right.
Just truly amazing stuff. One thing came to mind that I'll mention, because it's another little lesson learned from Portraits of Grief, that a lot of really senior reporters who were better known for long epics of stories were put in the position of writing these 200-word profiles, where they would find out about somebody and turn it into a postage stamp instead of instead of a front page story, jump story. But as I was looking at this and talking to Christine Kay, who was kind of running that Portraits of Grief situation, there was at the time one reporter who apparently just hated the idea of doing those 200-word profiles and refused to do them, and got into all kinds of trouble with it because he was just fighting about it. It's a fellow named Jason Blair. And specifically, he didn't like that he didn't get a byline on them. The rest of the Jason Blair thing kind of springs from that. It's something I look at in the chapter. But lessons learned.
That is very, very interesting. One of the, I wanted to go back to the journal, if I may. The judges cited the journal in the Pulitzer judges for breaking news for its comprehensive and insightful coverage executed under the most difficult circumstances. And what was interesting, though, Roy, is as I interviewed literally dozens of journal reporters and editors who participated on 9/11 or in the days afterward, the emphasis for so many of them was not on the under the most difficult circumstances, but on the comprehensive and insightful coverage. I don't want to speak, I don't want to speak for every one of them, but I think if I'm working on a full biography, a book on Paul Steiger. I think if you ask Paul Steiger, based upon all these interviews that I've already done with him, he would say he was most proud of the comprehensive and insightful coverage, and that it holds up really well 20 years later. I think Alan Murray, Washington bureau chief, would say the same. Jerry Seib. It was interesting when Jerry Seib is now the Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. At the time, he was deputy. And because I was doing the book, he went back and sort of reread their coverage from 9/11. And now, as Washington bureau chief 20 years later, again was saying that he's very proud of how accurate they were, of how insightful they were. They forecast, the Wall Street Journal forecast what the impact might be on the country, on the economy, on military spending, on things like that. And they did that on the fly, and so much of that turned out to be accurate. And, the question is, why did I write a book on the Wall Street Journal's coverage that day? The New York Times, if you look at it, actually won more 9/11 Pulitzer Prizes. Not that, by the way, not that the Pulitzer Prize is the only arbiter of good coverage on 9/11, but it won more. So why did I write about the Wall Street Journal? Well, true disclosure, for two reasons. One is, as I said, I was working on a book on Paul Steiger and thought that this would just be a chapter in his book. And then I came across literally more than 1,000 real-time emails and memos that the journal had, and I was blown away. And I said, this is just too good material. I didn't have that kind of insider information from other news organizations. But the second reason is that the journal is very unique. There is the Poynter Institute published this book,
Yes,
Have you seen this? Yeah,
sure.
and so it's a book. I don't know how to do this backwards, but it's a book that takes a look at all of the different front page headlines. Well, in some ways, I could have written I could have written either about all of these news organizations and what they did, or I could have picked any one of them. What made the journal different, and different from the New York Times, different from USA Today, the LA Times, the Washington Post, was it became a part of its own story. And because this took place outside its front door, literally, the Wall Street Journal was located just across West Street or the West Side Highway from the World Trade Center, and its main newsroom was destroyed on 9/11. And that goes to the second part of what the Pulitzer judges said, which was the executed under the most difficult circumstances. And I'll tell you something, Roy, that also speaks to the way journalists think and act. The journal did not cover its own story. The journal did not write about the fact that it had to evacuate its main newsroom by 10 o'clock on the morning of 9/11. Felicity Berenger, who covered the media for the New York Times, wrote the story on September 13th. She wrote the story about the journal's amazing ability to print a September 12th edition. The journal, as far as I know, to this day, has not written about itself. And that, to me, is awkward, because the reality of it is, if you're going to cover the 9/11 story, although certainly what happened to the Wall Street Journal was not, relatively speaking, important compared to what happened to all of the people who worked at the World Trade Center or the Pentagon, all the first responders who risked their lives or gave their lives in the process. But it is a story. This was the Wall Street Journal. It was the nation's most trusted business and financial daily. It really barely managed to put out a newspaper the next day. And I've written an entire book on 300 pages plus on how that happened. And to be honest with you, the book should have been much longer. I was rushing to get the book out in connection with the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, but I had to leave out an incredible amount of good information. And again, to this day, the journal hasn't done it. And I think one of the reviewers of the book said something that I didn't plant it, but I believed it, which said this was a story that had to be told. And it is a story that has to be told. And if you are a journalism junkie or a journalism student or a journalist or a journalism educator, not to take a look at, not to take a look at your book and understand what it was that went on behind the scenes at the New York Times so that they got the Pulitzer for public service, what happened behind the scenes at the Wall Street Journal that led them to get the Pulitzer for breaking news coverage. You're missing something incredibly important in terms of journalism insights.
I absolutely agree. And it brings up a couple of points to me. First of all, from my 24 years at the Wall Street Journal, it isn't surprising at all. I mean, how many times were we told, you're not the story, don't write about yourself, with the wonderful, delightful exception of first person A-heads, which I
Yeah.
absolutely love doing because it was like playing a trick
And
on my employer. You know,
the
you
A
write,
head is the middle. The A head was the quirky middle column for so many decades of the Wall Street Journal. Go ahead.
okay, but that was an amazing thing, was that you were able to do that. But boy, the editors, I had some just amazing editors, including Barney Kalame and Bill Blundell, and people who, as bureau chiefs, would always try to steer things away from it being about the coverage of the story. That was kind of off limits, again, with the exception of, I went on a game show and here's what happened to me. This is what you go through when you get into a game show, those kinds of things. So
In
that's,
one of the first stories I reported, I was with the Wall Street Journal in its bureaus. I was in Detroit, I was in Cleveland, Denver, Dallas, but one of the first stories I was involved with when I arrived in New York was the insider trading case against Foster Winans. Now, the Journal hated that for two reasons. One is it was one of its own reporters, columnists, who had basically defrauded the paper, defrauded investors, etc. And two is it couldn't avoid writing about itself. It had to write about itself.
Yes.
Right. So there have been exceptions, but mostly not. And this was something I got an email this morning from somebody who's in the book and a reporter. And he said, Dow Jones really ought to buy 500 copies of this and give it to every new reporter who comes there. Because the book is not, I'm not a fanboy of the Wall Street Journal. And I have been a critic of the Journal and many other news organizations for a long period of time. But this is something that the paper genuinely ought to be very proud of. What they did on 9/11, it was the complete opposite of the Foster Winans story. Foster Winans was embarrassing to them to have to write about. This is something that objectively, I haven't worked for the Journal since the 80s, standing outside looking in, was one of the finer moments in the paper's history, if not the finest moment in the paper's history. So maybe they'll correct that. Before we go ahead.
Can I make a couple of more points? I know.
Please. I want you to.
One is when we talk about first-person A-heads, we have to mention one of the most remarkable things in the September 12th edition, which was John Bussey's first-person A-head.
Well, it wasn't an A-head, but so just stay with that. I'm going to come. I'm going to
the column. It had the A-head.
Okay, well maybe it had the A. I want to just show you one show and tell a little more, and then you'll pick it up. This was the first. This was the 2-star edition on September 12th. This is the edition that went out early. And and John Bussey's story is not on the front page in this edition. It is, and in fact, if you look inside the second front page, also, again, this is the earliest edition they printed. Doesn't have a photo. What it does have is it lists World Trade Center tenants, and it just starts to have a list. So that is the 2-star. That's the earliest edition. Now the 4-star, and then I'll let you pick up on John Bussey and A-heads. This is the 4-star edition, and here are the 4 stars. This is the 4-star edition. Now here already is John Bussey's. Now you're saying, because you know this better than I do, you're saying that this headline format is still an A-head. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's only one on the front page, so that's the A-head.
Okay,
so A is the deck over the headline.
Okay, so here in the 4-star, his story did make, and then I'll let you pick up on his first person. And now, in 2001, it was rare, if not unprecedented, that they ran photos, and here's a photo that they ran in the 4-star on the front page of the second section. The Journal that day was only 32 pages. I'm sorry I interrupted, but I wanted to do show and tell. So go ahead.
You're suggesting I didn't get the 2-star then. The one I got up in Boston that morning, that was the rarity of coming into New York with the Wall Street Journal, was must have been a 3-star then, because it did have the Bussey story on page 1, which just riveted me.
So my guess is, I can't promise, but my guess is you actually got a 4-star, because what happened is in the 2-star, Bussey's story, I don't think even made it. In the 3-star, it was on the inside of the paper. And the 4-star, he was on the front page. So go ahead. But so you were going to say there was a first-person story.
Yeah, that comes from that. And I was talking about how rare it is for the Journal to talk about itself. And I would say that that's also true of the New York Times. If you look at the stories of the New York Times, they had to write about Jason Blair. That's for sure, eventually. But the amazing work that they did on Portraits of Grief and what won the Public Service Pulitzer Prize for them, is not something they ever wrote much about, except in the Pulitzer Prize story when it came out. They're similar to the Wall Street Journal that way. They don't like to write about themselves. So that was just about that.
Tell me, you had a couple of points, but just briefly, tell me a little bit more about how you pulled together the story on the Public Service Award at the New York Times. Obviously, you talked to Christine Kay. Did you talk to many of the reporters and editors?
Well, yeah, I mean, I did. It was a major story for me to look at because, you know, I was there for it myself and was reading it every day. And sort of like the Wall Street Journal, I really couldn't understand how a newspaper could come up with a plan for covering something like this. And Nation Challenge, as we kind of touched on, what made it so valuable is that it incorporated every element of 9/11 and its outgrowth and was able to put that under one banner so that it kind of did a Wall Street Journal front page every day for months because they were able, that's the way they viewed it. If we were attacking some, you know, Afghan province, that's part of a nation challenge. If it's a company that was destroyed or some building or someone dying, that was part of a nation challenge as well. So it was fascinating to me. I'm not sure the point I was going to make about that, but that's what set it apart. One thing that occurred to me, Dean, is that, you know, we talked about how the Wall Street Journal had never won a breaking news prize. You can sort of understand because, you know, they're more investigative and stuff. But the Wall Street Journal had never won a public service prize until a couple of years later. And that to me was kind of surprising. And it was because I think people sort of didn't view the journal as being a publication that would be in public service. It'd be more investigative or spot news or something like a breaking, not breaking news, but was amazing to me, was miraculous for me too, because it was just before my book came out. They won their first ever. So I got to do a kind of a personal view. It was the Boston Bureau that had written about stock option backdating. Yeah. And the Pulitzer Prizes viewed that series of stories and say, look, this was a terrific national contribution because it showed how business everywhere can cheat you. And I was very happy that they won that one. They haven't won one since, but one breaking news, one public service.
I have maybe two final points to make, and then if you have anything, and then we'll sign off, if you will. One is, and I was aware of this long before I ever had the idea for writing the book. If you recall, I used to publish a newsletter on influential business and financial news organizations called the TJFR Business News Reporter. And we would include bios, if you will, short bios of influential journalists. And one thing that I recall from that period of doing that, and the newsletter stopped in 2004, so it's well in the past, was that the journalists who worked together to put out the September 12th issue of the Wall Street Journal, and especially those who were in Lower Manhattan and had to slog through pools of blood and severed arms and legs and decapitated heads, they formed a kind of bond that endures to this day. And many of the people who I interviewed, like Gwendolyn Wendy Bounds, she's now one of the top editors at, if not the top editor at Consumer Reports. And, you know, Alan Murray is now at Fortune. And they are still so tight in terms of feeling a kinship to the people I used to work with at the Journal. And there are two reasons for that. One is their shared experience on 9/11 and the days and weeks after. And two is it's a kind of bonding. You and I have that same type of bonding. We both work for the Journal. And somehow or another, that commonality, it's a little bit like you and I both graduated from Northwestern University in Medill. There's a camaraderie there that extends. And I just wanted to observe that. The other thing is I had begun work. Again, I faced a tough deadline, Roy, to get this book out ahead of the 20th anniversary. And one of the sections that I had to discard, but may yet revive either online or in an updated edition, is a "Where Are They Now" section. So I talked about who the players were in the period of 9/11, but what's become of them is also very interesting. And I just want to, and I think, again, I think they would have all gone on to good success without 9/11, but I think the 9/11 experience, again, was part of the stew that led them to that. And I can't name everybody, but Joanne Lipman was hired by Condé Nast to launch Portfolio magazine. When it folded, she eventually became the chief content officer at Gannett and was editor-in-chief of USA Today. Marcus Broccoli became managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, and then when Murdoch bought the paper, soon thereafter, Marcus surfaced as the executive editor of the Washington Post. Steve Adler was one of the deputy managing editors on 9/11, helping to get out the paper. He went on to become the top editor at Reuters. I mentioned Alan Murray, who, again, was the Washington bureau chief and found himself now running Fortune magazine. He was editor-in-chief, and now he has some executive title. Any number of journal people left the journal and went into senior management positions at the New York Times. And so in some ways, the journal anyway was a sort of a farm club for top editors at other news organizations. But many of the deputy and other editors who were not Paul Steiger on 9/11 went on to head organizations. And of course, last but certainly not least, Paul Steiger left the Wall Street Journal and started ProPublica, which has grown into probably the world's most respected nonprofit journalism organization. And all of that was in the crucible. It all came out of the Dick Toffel, correct.
Well, the Wall Street Journal at the very top was responsible.
What I was saying, all of that came out of the crucible of the Wall Street Journal and the experience on 9/11. So that's a preview of maybe a update down the road of where are they now, or what became of them.
Yeah, and I had the same experience because with that 10 years later, I didn't have the people who had left. They were still there. Maybe Adler was gone. Some of them had gone. But that 10 years later story, I had that same feeling of an amazing bond that had formed between these people. And every time I'd go to the journal office, even when they moved to Midtown, I would still kind of track down these people that were in the middle of 9/11, John Bussey being one of them. And that bond was very, very clear. Of course, I was always talking to him about it too, because I had the honor of talking to them for that 10 years later. And I make one other point to bring us back to the museum. It's just worth saying, I think, the late lamented museum for several years had a really beautiful and moving exhibit on 9/11 that was there at the museum. I don't know if you ever got a chance to see it, but they actually had the heartbreaking iron grids from when you remember seeing the Twin Towers after they were destroyed and those iron posts sticking up still there. They brought those into the museum, and in addition to that, the book that had all the front pages, and Alicia Shepard, the book that you started with, Kathy Trost, of course, was a Wall Street Journal. So that's one of the things I miss most about the museum is that they had an amazing September 11th exhibit there that would have been worth seeing, I think, for decades to come.
Some of this stuff, and I have not been there, but some of the journalism stuff, and one of the museum is now part of like Johns Hopkins University or something. They helped me with some of this research because they still have the materials. And the 9/11 Museum in Lower Manhattan also has some of the journalism memorabilia. I left out three people that I can remember. There may be more, but three people who are still with the journal, who are central characters in my book, September 12th, include, I'm going to give you four people, but include John Bussey, who was the foreign editor at the time and is still, we're recording this in late August 2021, is still there. John Hilsenrath, who was covered and he covered 9/11 and was covered in 9/11 with terms of dust and other things. He's still there. Mike Miller, who was the page one editor but couldn't get to South Brunswick, so had to cede that role for the day. He ceded it to Larry Root. He's still with the Wall Street Journal. And Mike Sigonolfi is who was very involved in the early coverage after 9/11. He's still with the Wall Street Journal. So I wanted to mention that. I guess I want to ask you one final question and we'll wrap up. I talk about it a little bit in the book, but I'm aware of more than what I talk about in the book, and that is no small number of journal reporters developed post-traumatic stress disorder in the aftermath of 9/11, some of whom are still battling with it now 2 decades later. What did the same type of thing happen to your knowledge with any of the people from the New York Times, or was it the fact that the journal really was at ground zero, that it was more traumatic for those people?
Yeah, it's interesting. A number of people at the New York Times had kind of tragic early ends, but one of them being Gerald Boyd, the managing editor, one of the first people I talked to, and I guess it was several months, well, certainly several months after I did my book, he was gone. So that would have been mid 2005 or something. Yeah, I think it definitely the ground zero effect, the ground effect, must have had something to do with it. And I don't know, as you personally, I've run into people who had that. I don't know, except that the New York Times didn't have that, didn't lose their building, didn't have people scattered to the winds. They all ran to danger,
Right.
like
Right.
like the book says, and like happened with the journal too. That's my only suspicion about it, is that the journal was at ground zero.
So for students, academics, etc., Pulitzer's Gold, Roy J. Harris Jr.
Joy is in reading it.
Say what?
The joy is in reading it.
Yes, exactly. And September 12th, ground zero on 9/11 with the Wall Street Journal.
So
Glad we had a chat.
phenomenal job with the book. I'm
Thank
very,
you.
very happy for you.
Likewise to you. Always a pleasure to talk. Thanks for taking the time to share some of your own insights with me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dean. We'll be in touch.